January 1945. The war was ending, but for 12 young women in fading Luftwaffe uniforms, it was only beginning. Huddled in a freezing train rattling through Bavaria, they believed capture meant horror, the kind of terror their radios had promised the Allies would bring. Yet months later, thousands of miles away under a Texas sunrise, one simple meal would shatter everything they thought they knew about enemies, mercy, and the meaning of defeat. The train screamed through the Bavarian night like a dying animal, steel grinding against frozen rails that gleamed beneath the winter moon. Inside one unheated carriage, 12 women sat in silence, wrapped in Luftwaffe auxiliary coats that no longer held warmth. Their breath hung in the air like ghosts. Somewhere beyond the glass, artillery rumbled, distant, constant, and closing. Liesl Bauer kept her back straight, hands locked around a crumpled Red Cross leaflet. She had been a radio operator once, trained to send orders, to catch the enemy's voice in the static. Now her fingers trembled not from duty but hunger. Across from her, 19-year-old Anna Voigt wept quietly, face buried in her collar. Beside her, Marta Koenig stared at the dark horizon, jaw set hard enough to crack. They had all heard Goebbels' voice in their headphones, the sermons of pride and fear, better death than captivity. The Americans are beasts. They will take your dignity before they take your life. Those words still clung to them like frost. When the train finally screeched to a stop at dawn, silence fell. The doors slid open with a groan, and cold air sliced through the carriage. On the platform stood a line of men in heavy coats, rifles slung over shoulders. American soldiers, young, exhausted, but calm. Their faces looked nothing like the monsters from propaganda reels. No one moved. Then one soldier spoke, his voice steady but foreign. "Come out, slowly." The women obeyed. Boots hit snow, and for the first time they stepped into captivity. Not as soldiers of a Reich, but as lost, frightened human beings. The march began at sunrise. Snow fell in thin, needling flurries as the women trudged through empty Bavarian fields, guarded by American soldiers whose breath steamed in the morning air. No one shouted, no one struck. Commands came quietly, almost politely, translated through gestures more than words. Yet fear clung to every step. Liesel's boots pinched with cold. Her breath burned her throat. She kept her eyes low, watching the snow turn gray under the soldiers' boots. Beside her, Anna stumbled once, catching herself on Liesel's sleeve. Marta muttered something sharp in German, a warning to stay upright, to keep dignity even in defeat. When they reached the trucks waiting by the roadside, the women hesitated. They expected cages, chains. Instead, the Americans handed them canteens of water. One soldier even offered a cigarette to Marta, who stared at it as though it were a test. She refused, eyes narrowed. By evening, they arrived at a bomb-shattered port, Le Havre. The Atlantic wind screamed through broken cranes and twisted steel. Amid the ruins floated an enormous gray ship, a Liberty vessel, its deck crowded with German prisoners waiting to board. The women stood apart, uncertain, as guards directed them up the gangway. The metal rang beneath their feet, echoing into the cold sky. On board, they were met not by cruelty but by routine. Blankets were issued, thin but clean. Bowls of soup, watery but warm, were handed out by medics wearing Red Cross armbands. Even frostbitten toes were treated without words of scorn. It confused them more than comforted them. Marta leaned close to Liesel that night in the dark hold, whispering, "It is a trick. They feed us so we live long enough for worse." Her tone was hard, but her eyes flickered with something Liesel hadn't seen before. Doubt. Days blurred into waves and storms. The ship pitched violently across the Atlantic, its engines thundering deep below deck. The prisoners grew sick, but the Americans maintained their strange order. Meals at the same time. Inspections, water, medicine. One evening, as wind howled outside, an American sailor, barely older than Liesel, passed through the hold with a tray of metal mugs. He stopped before Anna, smiled shyly, and offered one to her. She took it with trembling hands. The mug was filled with coffee, black and hot. Their eyes met for a heartbeat before he moved on. Anna whispered after him. He smiled. At me, Marta scoffed softly in the dark. They smile before they strike. But no strike came. When land finally appeared, it was through a drifting veil of fog. The skyline rose like something from a dream, jagged towers of glass and steel, unlike any city they'd ever known. New York. The Statue of Liberty loomed ghost-like in the haze, her torch glinting in pale morning light. Liesel stared at it through the porthole, unable to look away. The symbol meant nothing to her, yet something in it stirred uneasily, a whisper of contradiction. Could the enemy truly build something so beautiful? They didn't stay long. Within hours they were processed. Names taken, uniforms recorded, numbers assigned. Then came another train. Westward, the journey stretched for days. Through rolling fields, endless plains, small wooden towns that seemed untouched by war. Children waved at the passing cars. Cows grazed in pastures. It unsettled Liesel, this calm world that existed while her homeland burned. At night she lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of the wheels and thought of her mother's face. Was she still alive? Did she know her daughter now rode a train through enemy land, not as a soldier but as a prisoner? When the train finally slowed, the air that met them was warm, dry, dust-scented, foreign. Texas. A camp stood beyond the tracks. Barbed wire, guard towers, low wooden barracks. Yet it was clean, organized, almost domestic. The guards looked more like farmers than conquerors. As the women were led through the gates, Liesel felt her fear twist into something stranger. Confusion. This wasn't what she'd been told captivity would look like. The camp gates clanged shut behind them with a hollow finality. Inside, the air smelled of dust and pine. Rows of barracks stretched out across the flat Texan plain, each surrounded by fences topped with barbed wire that shimmered in the afternoon sun. A watchtower loomed above, but no one shouted. No dogs barked. The guards stood at ease, rifles slung casually, chatting in English as if they were farmers discussing weather. Liesel and the other women were herded toward a registration hut. An officer in a clean khaki uniform sat behind a desk, flanked by a translator. He was calm, middle-aged, with reading glasses perched on his nose. He asked their names one by one. Name? Rank? Function? His tone more bureaucratic than hostile. When Liesel answered, his pencil scratched quietly over a form. Radio operator, Luftwaffe, he repeated. Then he looked up and said, almost gently, "You're safe here, Fräulein Bauer." She didn't believe him. None of them did. Their new quarters were small wooden rooms lined with bunks. There were mattresses, thin but soft, blankets that smelled faintly of soap. At first, no one touched the food left for them. Bread, beans, coffee. It had to be poisoned, they thought. Some form of trick to test obedience. But when one of the guards returned later and ate from the same tray without hesitation, hunger won over fear. Days began to settle into routine. Roll call at dawn. Work assignments, some to the camp kitchen, others to laundry or gardening. It was strange. They were prisoners, yet treated more like workers. Guards gave them nicknames. Some even smiled. It was Marta who remained most defiant. "Don't forget what they did to our cities," she warned one night. "This kindness, it's camouflage. The Americans are clever. They fight with deception." Liesel nodded, but she couldn't ignore what her own eyes kept showing her. The guards didn't leer. They didn't strike. They didn't mock. In fact, they seemed almost indifferent, more concerned with routine than vengeance. Weeks passed. The Texas sun grew hotter, bleaching the sky pale. Some of the women began to relax, laughing in whispers, trading words of English with the guards. Anna, the youngest, began sketching in a small notebook she'd found, drawing the camp, the men, even the endless desert beyond the fence. Then came the breakfast. It began as an ordinary morning, lineup, head count, and then, unexpectedly, a guard motioned for the women to follow him to the mess hall. Inside, long wooden tables were set for them. On each plate sat something none of them recognized. Biscuits covered in thick white sauce, dotted with pieces of sausage. Steam rose gently into the air. The guard spoke through a translator. "Today you eat with us." "American breakfast." Silence fell. Marta crossed her arms, muttering, "It's another trick. Look, they want to humiliate us." But the smell was overwhelming. Rich, savory, almost comforting. Liesel hesitated, watching as one of the guards sat down beside them, grabbed a fork, and began eating from the same dish. No hesitation, no cruelty, just breakfast. One by one, the women followed. Forks scraped against plates. Chewing replaced fear. Liesel took her first bite. The food melted warm on her tongue, creamy, salty, soft. Something broke inside her chest. Not from pleasure, but confusion. Was this the enemy? The barbaric nation their propaganda had warned of? These men who treated them like guests at a kitchen table? For a moment she forgot the war. The hunger, the rubble, the screams of air raids, all of it faded beneath the simple act of eating a meal cooked by those she'd been taught to hate. When she looked up, the guard across from her, the same young soldier who'd smiled at Anna on the ship, raised his mug and said in hesitant German, "Good morning." Anna giggled. Marta glared. Lucille said nothing. But in that silence, something irreversible shifted. That night, lying in her bunk, Lucille stared at the wooden ceiling. The image of the meal replayed over and over. The warmth of the food, the laughter, the easy rhythm of the guards talking among themselves. It haunted her more deeply than any bombing raid. Because for the first time she realized something terrifying. If the enemy could be kind, then everything she'd believed, everything she'd fought for, might have been a lie. The next morning, the camp felt different, quieter. The women worked in silence, each haunted by their own private thoughts. Even Marta spoke less. Days turned into weeks, and small acts of humanity continued to erode their defenses. A guard helped fix a loose shoe. Another shared a photograph of his family. When a dust storm tore through the camp, soldiers and prisoners alike ran together to secure the laundry lines. No one cared about ranks or flags in that moment. Lucille began keeping notes in the margins of an old field manual she'd salvaged from her uniform pocket. Not messages of war, but fragments of thought. They are not monsters. They bleed the same. They smile. She hid it beneath her mattress, ashamed of the softness growing inside her. By midsummer, Texas had turned to fire. The air shimmered above the wire fences. Cicadas screamed from the scrub, and even the guards' khaki uniforms darkened with sweat. Inside the camp, life moved in slow, drowsy rhythm. Work, meals, silence. The women's skin had browned from the sun, their fear dulled by routine, but war was still out there. Rumors drifted through the camp like dust. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. For hours after the news arrived, no one spoke. The guards said nothing, waiting for the shock to settle. Lucille sat on her bunk, the paper trembling in her hands. Surrender. The word felt impossible, heavy, almost obscene. "What happens to us now?" Anna whispered. No one had an answer. Marta spat on the floor. "We'll be forgotten. Prisoners of a country that doesn't even need enemies anymore." That night, a storm broke over the desert. Rain fell hard against the barracks, hammering the roof like artillery. Lightning flickered across the sky, and for a moment, Lucille imagined she was back home, the sound of thunder echoing like bombs over Munich. She wept quietly, her face buried in the blanket. Not for her nation, not even for the lost war, but for the realization that her entire understanding of right and wrong had collapsed. The enemy had won, and shown mercy. The next morning, the camp commandant assembled them in the yard. He was a broad-shouldered man, gray around the temples, holding a sheet of paper. "Ladies," he began through the translator, "Germany has surrendered. You are now prisoners of peace. The war is over. You will remain here until arrangements for repatriation are made." The women listened, blank-eyed. When he finished, a strange silence fell. Not relief, not despair, but something emptier. Over the next weeks, the camp began to change. Security loosened. The guards became almost friendly. They talked about going home, about wives and farms and lives waiting beyond the wire. For the first time, Lucille saw them not as soldiers, but as men. Ordinary, tired, human, and she hated that she could see it. One afternoon, while working in the garden, Lucille heard a guard humming softly as he watered the tomato plants. It was a hymn, slow, mournful. She recognized the melody. It was the same church song her mother used to hum while washing dishes. Without thinking, she began to hum along. The guard looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. That night, she wrote in her hidden notebook. He knew the same song. How can that be? The small, fragile humanity in those moments began to fill the camp like sunlight through cracks in a wall. Guards brought books. Prisoners were allowed to paint murals on the barracks. One afternoon, an American truck brought a crate of records, jazz, swing, strange, happy music that made even Marta tap her fingers against the table before catching herself. When Christmas came, The camp's mess hall filled with the smell of cinnamon and coffee. A tree was decorated with paper stars. The guards invited the women to join them for dinner. They hesitated until Anna, trembling, accepted. They ate together under dim yellow light, laughter cutting through the quiet like something forbidden. Someone played a harmonica, someone else sang, and for a few fleeting hours, the war felt like a dream that had finally released its grip. After the meal, Liselle walked outside. The night was cool, stars hanging low over the desert. The guard who had once smiled at Anna approached her, hands in his pockets. "You'll go home soon," he said in broken German. "Germany. We'll need good people." She looked at him, unsure whether to feel gratitude or guilt. "There are no good people left," she said softly. He shook his head. "Then start again." When he walked away, Liselle stood in the dark until her eyes blurred. The wind carried the faint scent of pine from somewhere beyond the fence. Start again. The word stuck with her for days. In January 1946, orders came for their release. One by one, the prisoners were processed out, their numbers crossed from ledgers, their fingerprints archived. They were given civilian clothes, travel rations, and a few dollars each for the journey home. As Liesel packed her small bundle, she unfolded the notebook hidden beneath her mattress. The pages were filled now, fragments of thought, sketches of faces, pieces of memory. She hesitated, then tore out the final sheet and slipped it into her pocket. On it, she had written, "The enemy fed me. The enemy sheltered me. The enemy showed me kindness. Perhaps the enemy was never who I thought it was. The journey home was long. The train carried them east through green plains and mountains, through towns untouched by war. Every mile brought the silence of memory, a silence that no one dared to break. When their ship docked in Europe, the women stepped onto soil that no longer felt like theirs. Germany was unrecognizable, its cities hollow, its people gaunt and gray. The flags were gone, the pride gone with them. Liesel walked through the ruins of Munich weeks later, finding her old street half buried under rubble. The house where her mother once sang was gone. Only a fragment of wall remained, a small piece of wallpaper still clinging to brick. She stood there for a long time, holding that final scrap of her notebook between her fingers. The enemy fed me. She folded the paper, tucked it into the rubble, and turned away. Years later, Liesel would tell her granddaughter about the morning she ate biscuits and gravy for the first time, how it was the moment the war truly ended for her. Not with surrender or treaties or parades, but with a meal served by someone she'd been taught to hate. "The world doesn't end with battles," she would say. "It ends when we finally see the humanity on the other side. That's when war dies, quietly at a breakfast table. History rarely ends with gunfire. Sometimes it ends with silence, or the scrape of a fork against a metal plate." For Liesel Bauer, the war didn't end on the day Germany surrendered. It ended the moment she realized her captors were human, when mercy came not through ideology or victory, but through something as small as a shared meal. In that Texas camp, surrounded by wire and dust, the old world began to unravel. The lies told over years of propaganda, about cruelty, about purity, about the absolute nature of good and evil, all began to crack under the weight of ordinary kindness. Many of those women never spoke of their time in captivity again. When they returned home, they were met not with welcome, but with suspicion. Germany in 1946 didn't want to hear about decency from the enemy. It wanted anger, blame, and silence. But Liesel remembered. She remembered the heat of the Texan sun, the calm in the guard's eyes, the taste of biscuits and gravy that morning, the meal that unmade everything she thought she knew about war. In the years that followed, she built a quiet life. She married. She taught. She planted a garden that smelled of tomatoes and rosemary. Yet sometimes, when thunder rolled over the horizon, she would stop what she was doing and stare into the distance, seeing not destruction, but that endless desert sky and the faces of men who had once been her jailers, but who treated her with dignity. Decades later, when her granddaughter asked her what war felt like, Liesel didn't speak of bombs or uniforms. She didn't talk about loss or victory. She simply said, "It felt like believing you were right until you were fed by the people you thought were wrong." She passed away in 1998 at the age of 74. Among her belongings was a small yellowed page, tucked inside an old Bible. On it were 6 words, written in faded pencil. "The enemy fed me." I changed. Narrator. Closing. In every war, the real battles aren't always fought with guns. They're fought in the quiet corners of the human heart, where hate meets mercy, and where belief collides with truth. For 12 young women who once served the Reich, redemption didn't come through ideology or victory or even repentance. It came through something far simpler, the realization that kindness, even from an enemy, has the power to dismantle an entire world of lies. And somewhere, across the fading echoes of history, that lesson remains. Written not in books or monuments, but in the fragile memory of one breakfast in Texas, on a morning when humanity for a moment won the war. Ples subcrib my Chanel.